The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee, a smell I associated with serious, adult problems. It clung to the polished mahogany of the large desk that sat between us and the lawyer, a man whose glasses were perched so low on his nose they seemed in danger of falling off. My mother twisted the strap of her purse in her lap, the vinyl squeaking in the heavy silence. My father sat unnervingly still, his hands clasped on his knees, his face a mask of worry. They both looked at me, not at the man who held our future in a stack of stapled documents. "As you can see here," the lawyer said, tapping a paragraph with a manicured finger, Section 4B pertains to the liability clause. It states that the lessor is indemnified against any and all claims arising from. His voice droned on, a river of jargon I had learned to navigate years ago. My own voice, when it came out, was a cold, practiced calm. I translated his words into Vietnamese, my tone even, betraying none of the panic simmering in my stomach. I broke down the legal terms into simpler concepts, words my parents could understand. Indemnified. Liability. Clause. Each word was a stone I had to carry across a treacherous river for them. My mother's eyes widened slightly as I explained. My father's jaw tightened. They didn't need to understand the English words, they understood the weight of them through me. I was their filter, their shield, their bridge to this world that still felt foreign to them after 2 decades. The lawyer paused, looking at me expectantly. The entire room was waiting for me. For the 19-year-old girl to make the next move. I took a breath, my throat dry. I opened my mouth to ask a clarifying question, and the world tilted. 3 months earlier. The alarm on my phone didn't buzz, it screamed. A jarring, electronic shriek I'd chosen specifically to cut through the fog of exhaustion. 6:30 a.m. My first class was at 9, but my other job, the one I didn't get paid for, started the moment I opened my eyes. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cold against my feet. In the kitchen, the light was already on. My mother stood at the counter, holding a letter with a windowed envelope. Her brow was furrowed in the way it always was when faced with official-looking mail. "Lin," she said in Vietnamese, her voice tight with anxiety. "Come look at this for Mom." I took the letter. It was from the electric company. The big, red, past due stamp was hard to miss. I scanned the text. It was a final notice. They were threatening to shut off the power in 3 days. I sighed, a familiar weariness settling deep into my bones. "It's okay, me," I said, switching to English out of habit before correcting myself. "It's just the electric bill. We're late. I'll call them after my class." Her shoulders sagged with relief. "Oh. Okay, Con. Thank you." She patted my arm, her gratitude so immense for something so simple. She then turned her attention to the stove, where a pot of pho was simmering, its fragrant aroma of star anise and cinnamon filling our small Houston home. The broth was her love language. The letters were my burden. It had always been this way. I was born here. The first American-made product in our family. My brother, Qua, was 3 when we immigrated from Vietnam. He was all sharp edges and boundless energy, a boy who learned English on the playground with the scraped knees and easy laughter of a child. But when he was 10, and I was 7, our grandparents' health began to fail back home. With heavy hearts, my parents made a choice. They sent Qua back to Vietnam to be raised by them, to keep the connection to the homeland alive. And just like that, I became an only child. The designated translator. The cultural attaché. The one who had to grow up a little too fast. It started small. Translating for the cashier at the grocery store when I was 9. Filling out school permission slips when I was 10. By 11, I was on the phone with the cable company, arguing about a billing error. At 14, I sat in a doctor's office, my face flushed with embarrassment, as I had to explain my mother's very personal medical symptoms to a male doctor. I missed birthday parties, sleepovers, and school dances for appointments I couldn't reschedule and forms that couldn't wait. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. They were my parents. They needed me. I never questioned it. My life was a carefully balanced routine. Morning classes at the community college. Afternoon shifts at the Boba Bliss tea shop. Evenings spent doing homework with one hand and fielding calls from my parents' nail salon with the other. Lynn, a customer wants to know if we do shellac with chrome powder. Lynn, the credit card machine is making a weird noise. Lynn, can you read this email from the landlord? I lived in a constant state of low-level anxiety, my phone always on, my ringer always loud, waiting for the next small crisis only I could solve. Then, 3 months ago, everything changed. The catalyst was a crackly, overseas phone call. My grandfather had passed away. After the wave of grief came the logistical tsunami. And at its center was my brother, Kwa. He was 22 now. With our grandfather gone and our grandmother moving in with an aunt, it was time for him to come home. To America. My parents were ecstatic. The return of their prodigal son filled the house with a light I hadn't seen in years. They cleaned his room, the one that had been used for storage for a decade. They bought him a new bed, new clothes, a new laptop. Their long-lost boy was returning. I was happy too, of course. I barely remembered him. My memories of Kwa were faded photographs, a lanky boy with a toothy grin, a protective hand on my shoulder. For 12 years, he had been a voice on the phone, a face on a grainy video call. I was excited to have a brother again. Someone my own age in the house. A potential ally. The day we picked him up from George Bush Intercontinental Airport was pure chaos. My mother cried. My father, a man who rarely showed emotion, hugged him so tight I thought Kwa's ribs might crack. Kwa himself looked different. He was taller, broader, with a confidence that seemed distinctly Western. He wore a brand-name jacket and stylish sneakers, a stark contrast to my father's simple work clothes. His English was surprisingly good. Accented, yes, but clear and functional. He'd taken classes in Saigon, he explained, preparing for his return. A wave of relief washed over me. He can help, I thought. He can share the load. That first night, my mother cooked a feast fit for a king. The table was laden with his favorite dishes, cha gio, bun thit noang, kenchua. All the things she hadn't made in years. The conversation revolved entirely around him. Are you tired from the flight, Contre? My father asked, his voice full of concern. How was the food on the plane? My mother chimed in. Do you like your new room? Kwa answered with an easy smile, soaking in the attention like a plant starved for sun. He talked about his friends in Vietnam, the food he would miss, his plans to see what America is all about. I tried to join in. What was it like, living there for so long? I asked. Everyone glanced at me for a second, as if they'd forgotten I was there. Kwa shrugged. It was okay. You know. Kind of old-fashioned. I'm glad to be in a modern country now. He turned his attention back to my father, asking about American cars. My question was left hanging in the air, unanswered. I felt a strange pang in my chest. A feeling I couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the feeling of becoming invisible. In the days that followed, that feeling grew. My parents doted on Kwa. They gave him money, no questions asked. They didn't ask him to get a job. Let him adjust, my mother would say. He's been away for so long. He slept in until noon, played video games, and went out with new friends he made online. He was a guest in our home, a celebrated visitor. Meanwhile, my responsibilities didn't change. If anything, they increased. Now there were forms for Kwa's social security number, his driver's permit application, his college enrollment. And every single time, my parents would slide the papers in front of me. Lynn, help your brother with this. One afternoon, I found Kwa in the living room, trying to set up his new phone plan online. He was getting frustrated, clicking furiously. "This website is so stupid," he muttered. "Do you need a hand?" I offered, peering over his shoulder. He sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound, and pushed the laptop towards me. "Here. You do it. Your English is better." I gritted my teeth but sat down and navigated the confusing portals and drop-down menus. I typed in his personal information, selected his plan, and entered my mother's credit card details. He watched me, scrolling through his phone, occasionally grunting in response to my questions. When I was done, I pushed the laptop back to him. "There. It's all set up. The SIM card will arrive in a few days." "Cool. Thanks," he said, not looking up from his screen. He put on a pair of headphones, and just like that, I was dismissed. I stood there for a moment, a knot tightening in my stomach. It wasn't about trust, as he would later claim. It wasn't that my English was better. It was that it was easier. It was easier to hand the problem to me, the family's built-in, on-call, 24/7 support system. For 12 years, I had been the only one. But now there were two of us. Two adult children living under this roof. Yet, the load was still mine alone. And for the first time in my life, I started to question why. The ground beneath my feet, the foundation of family and duty I had always stood on, was beginning to feel unstable. The first hairline cracks were starting to show. The weeks that followed Kwa's arrival settled into a new, unsettling rhythm. The house felt smaller, crowded not by his physical presence, but by the space he took up in our parents' minds. He was a constant topic of conversation at the dinner table. "Kwa is so smart, he figured out the new television remote," my mother would announce with pride. I would bite my tongue, resisting the urge to say that I was the one who had spent an hour on the phone with customer service to get it working in the first place. My father would watch Kwa play video games, a small, proud smile on his face. "So fast," he'd murmur in Vietnamese. His reflexes are very sharp. He never said anything when he saw me hunched over my textbooks, my own mind racing to absorb theories and formulas. My academic achievements were expected, a baseline requirement. Kwa's ability to win a virtual car race was a marvel. I started spending more time at work and the library, seeking refuge in the quiet anonymity of those places. My best friend, Chloe, noticed the change in me immediately. We were wiping down the counters at Boba Bliss after a rush, the sweet, milky smell of tea still hanging in the air. "You seem somewhere else lately," she said, her voice gentle. Chloe was the complete opposite of my family's chaotic energy. She was calm, observant, and fiercely logical. I forced a smile. "Just tired. Midterms are coming up." She looked at me, her blue eyes seeing more than I wanted them to. "Is it about your brother?" I paused, my hand hovering over a sticky patch of spilled syrup. I hadn't told her much, just that he was back. But Chloe knew about my other life, the one as the family translator. She'd been there when I'd had to cancel our movie plans to rush my dad to an urgent care clinic for a minor injury he couldn't explain to the nurses. "It's just an adjustment," I said finally, the words feeling thin and inadequate. "He's an adult, Lynn," she said, her tone not unkind. "He can adjust himself. You don't have to do it for him." Her words echoed in my mind on the drive home. You don't have to do it for him. But in my family, helping wasn't a choice, it was an obligation woven into the very fabric of our existence. To refuse was to unravel everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had just gotten home from a grueling 3-hour shift, my feet aching and my uniform smelling faintly of burnt sugar. I was looking forward to a hot shower and collapsing into bed. My mother was waiting for me in the living room. It was the same setup as the day with the electric bill, she was sitting on the edge of the sofa, holding a piece of mail as if it were a live grenade. The logo in the corner was unmistakable, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. My stomach dropped. These were the worst ones. "Lynn, this came for me today," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I took the letter. It was a notice for a biometrics appointment, a standard part of her green card renewal process. Fingerprints, a photo, a signature. Simple enough, but the formal language and the government seal were enough to send her into a panic. The appointment was for next Thursday at 10 a.m. "Okay, it's just for fingerprints," I reassured her, my voice on autopilot. "It won't take long." "You'll come with me, right?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a statement of fact. "You need to take the morning off work." I looked at the date. Thursday. I was scheduled to open the boba shop. It was my most important shift, the one I couldn't easily trade. My manager was already stretched thin. "Me, I can't," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I have to work. I can't miss it." A frown creased her forehead. "This is more important than making tea, Lynn. This is for my papers." "I know, but..." I took a breath, the idea Chloe had planted in my mind taking root. I glanced towards the hallway, where the sound of explosions from Kwa's video game echoed softly. "Why don't you ask Kwa to go with you? His English is good enough for this. They'll just ask for your name and show you where to put your fingers." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, alien and unwelcome. My mother stared at me as if I'd just suggested we sprout wings and fly to the appointment. Her response was swift and dismissive. "Kwa," she said, shaking her head. "He's not used to this stuff. He doesn't know how these places work. It's just easier with you." Easier with you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not better, not safer. Easier. I was a convenience. A tool sharpened over years of use, familiar and reliable. Kwa was the new, shiny thing, too precious to be sullied by the grime of responsibility. Something inside me, a tightly wound coil of resentment I had been suppressing for a decade, finally snapped. My voice came out, low and sharp, devoid of its usual placating warmth. "Yeah," I said, the single word dripping with a bitterness that startled even me. "It's easier with me because I've been forced to do it since I was a child." My mother recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. She had never heard me speak this way. I couldn't stop. The words tumbled out, a torrent of frustration. "I have a life, me. A job. School. I can't just drop everything every time a letter comes in the mail. Kwa is right here. He's 22 years old. He lives here for free and hasn't done a single thing to help. Why is it always me?" The sound of the video game abruptly stopped. A moment later, my father appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. Kwa hovered behind him, his face a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "What is this?" my father demanded in Vietnamese, his gaze landing on me. "Why are you yelling at your mother?" "She's saying she won't go to the appointment with me," my mother said, her voice now thick with wounded tears. "She wants me to take Kwa." My father's face darkened. He looked at me, his eyes full of disappointment. "Lynn, what is wrong with you? We are your parents. Family helps family without complaining." "I'm not complaining." I shot back, my voice rising. "I'm stating a fact. I have been your personal assistant, your secretary, and your translator for my entire life. I've missed school, I've missed work, I've missed out on being a kid because I was always taking care of your adult responsibilities. Now you have another adult child living in this house, and you still expect me to do everything. It's not fair." "Fair?" My father's voice was dangerously low. "We fed you, clothed you, gave you a roof over your head. Is that not fair? You are being selfish and ungrateful. Ungrateful. The word was a slap in the face. Every sacrifice I had made, every moment of my childhood I had given up, was erased and replaced with that single, ugly word. I looked past him, at my brother. Kwa stood there, silent, his arms crossed. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a spot on the wall, as if this whole ugly scene had nothing to do with him. His silence was the most damning response of all. He could have stepped in. He could have said, "It's okay, I'll go." He could have done anything. He did nothing. A profound and chilling silence descended on the room. The four of us stood there, a family fractured. My mother was crying softly. My father was radiating righteous anger. My brother was a statue of indifference. And I was an island, isolated by a sea of my own making. I had finally said the unsayable, and I could feel the invisible threads that held us together straining, about to snap. I had crossed a boundary, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that there was no going back. The aftermath of my outburst was not a fiery explosion, but a cold, suffocating silence. It was a silence that followed me from room to room, a tangible presence in our small house. My parents no longer asked me for anything. They didn't even seem to see me. I would walk into the kitchen for a glass of water, and whatever conversation they were having with Kwa in Vietnamese would die on their lips. They would turn to him, their faces soft and loving, and then their eyes would slide past me, hard and unforgiving, as if I were a ghost in my own home. Meals became an exercise in torture. We would sit at the small dining table, the clinking of our chopsticks against the ceramic bowls the only sound. My parents would heap food onto Kwa's plate, asking him if it was to his liking, if he wanted more. My bowl remained as I had served it. It was a petty, childish punishment, but it was surprisingly effective. It made me feel like I was 11 years old again, being disciplined for a poor report card. The shame was hot and heavy in my chest. Kwa, for his part, acted as if nothing was wrong. He floated through the tension with an almost impressive obliviousness. The day after the argument, I found him in the living room, watching TV. "You're being really dramatic, you know," he said, not taking his eyes off the screen. I stopped, staring at the back of his head. Dramatic? Kwa, I've been handling their entire lives for 10 years. You've been here for 3 months and haven't even offered to take out the trash. He finally turned to look at me, an expression of mild irritation on his face. "It's not my fault they trust you more. You know how they are. They're old-fashioned. They don't like to bother me." "They don't bother you because you've made it clear you're not available," I retorted, my voice low and angry. "And it's not about trust. It's about a 22-year-old man acting like a spoiled child while his younger sister carries the weight of the entire family." He just shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference that made my blood boil. "Whatever. It's not my problem." He turned back to the TV, effectively ending the conversation. It was then I realized the depth of the problem. He didn't see me as his sister. He saw me as part of the household infrastructure, like the plumbing or the electricity. I was the one who just handled things. My function was my identity. The immigration appointment came and went. I don't know who went with my mother. I imagined her struggling through it alone, or maybe my father closed the nail salon for the morning. They didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. The wall of silence between us was too high to shout over. A part of me, the guilty part, churned with anxiety, picturing my mother lost and confused in the sterile government building. But another, stronger part of me knew this was necessary. A wire has to be stripped before a new connection can be made. My refuge continued to be boba bliss. The simple, repetitive tasks of scooping tapioca pearls and sealing plastic cups were a balm to my frayed nerves. "So," Chloe said one afternoon as we restocked the milk powders. "Radio silence is the new strategy, huh?" I told her everything. The words had poured out of me in a messy, tearful confession in her car after a shift. She had just listened, nodding, passing me napkins from her glove compartment. "It's their strategy, not mine," I mumbled, scooping taro powder into a container. "I'm just living with it. Or around it." "It's emotional blackmail, Lynn," she stated plainly. "They're punishing you for setting a boundary. That's what people do when they're used to having all the control." "It feels awful," I admitted. "I feel like I abandoned them." "Did you?" she challenged, stopping her work to look at me. "Or did you just stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm? There's a difference." Her words were a life raft in the sea of my guilt. She was right. I hadn't abandoned them. I was still there, living under the same roof. I just wasn't willing to be their designated sacrifice anymore. The thought gave me a sliver of strength. The first test of this new reality came on a Saturday morning. I was in my room, trying to study for a history midterm, when I heard my father's frustrated voice from the living room. It was followed by my mother's anxious tones. I put on my headphones, determined to block them out. It wasn't my problem. It wasn't my problem. I repeated the mantra in my head until it was a dull hum beneath the professor's recorded lecture. A few minutes later, there was a sharp knock on my door. I ignored it. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I sighed, pulled off my headphones, and opened the door. My father stood there, his face a mask of frustration. It was the first time he had sought me out in over a week. "The credit card machine at the salon is broken," he said in Vietnamese, his words clipped. "It won't accept any payments." This was a common issue. A software glitch, a connection error. Usually, I'd just get on the phone with the processing company and have it sorted in 15 minutes. I looked at him, my expression neutral. "That's too bad," I said in English. His eyes narrowed. He clearly expected me to jump into action. "We're losing business. People are leaving because they can't pay with a card. You need to call them." I leaned against the doorframe. "I'm studying for a midterm, Ba. Kwa is here. Why don't you ask him?" The suggestion was met with a huff of exasperation. "He's busy," my father snapped. I could hear the distinct sound of a car chase from a movie coming from the living room. "Busy? Just call them, Lynn," he said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a command. "Stop being difficult." This was the moment. The crossroads. I could cave, and everything would go back to the way it was. The silence would end, replaced by the familiar weight of expectation. Or I could hold the line. I took a deep breath. "I can't right now," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "The number for technical support should be on a sticker on the side of the machine. I'm sure if Kwa explains the problem slowly, they can help him." My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. He looked at me not with anger, but with a kind of stunned disbelief. It was as if his most reliable appliance had suddenly refused to turn on. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. For the next hour, I could hear the chaos unfolding. I heard my father yelling at Kwa to speak more clearly. I heard Kwa's frustrated voice, trying and failing to describe the error message on the small screen. It's saying a bad connection. No, a batch error. I heard my mother in the background, telling them to just try unplugging it and plugging it back in, her voice shrill with panic. The symphony of their incompetence was a strange mix of vindication and deep, aching guilt. I wanted them to succeed without me. I truly did. But I also needed them to understand that my help was not an infinite resource, not a given. It was a gift, and one they had taken for granted for far too long. Finally, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. "What is the account password?" I stared at the message. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could give it to them. Or I could make them find it. I had written all the important passwords in a notebook that I kept in the kitchen drawer, a fact I had reminded them of many times. I texted back, "It's in the red notebook in the junk drawer." A few minutes later, I heard a triumphant shout from Kwa. They must have figured it out. The house fell quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. It was less hostile, more thoughtful. I had refused to fix their problem, but I had still given them the tool to fix it themselves. It was a small distinction, but it felt monumental. I had drawn a line not in the sand, but in wet cement. This was my space. This was their problem. And for the first time, they had solved it, however clumsily, without me. The small victory with the credit card machine created a subtle shift in the household atmosphere. The icy wall of silence began to thaw, replaced by a sort of awkward, uncertain truce. My parents started speaking to me again, though their words were cautious, like they were testing the structural integrity of a newly repaired bridge. "Lynn, do you need a ride to school?" my father might ask, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "There is leftover pho in the fridge if you are hungry," my mother would mention as she passed me in the hall. They were small offerings, olive branches extended across the divide I had created. I accepted them with quiet civility. I didn't want a war. I just wanted peace with fair terms. I continued to focus on my studies and my job, building a life for myself that existed outside the four walls of our house. For the first time, I joined a study group on campus. I went out for late-night coffee with Chloe without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I was breathing my own air, and it was intoxicating. Kwa, however, seemed to have learned nothing from the incident. He saw their temporary incompetence not as a sign that he needed to step up, but as an annoying interruption to his leisure time. He complained for days about how boring it was to be on the phone with tech support. Their English was so bad, he said at dinner, a statement so lacking in self-awareness it was almost impressive. My father just grunted in response, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe? It was a crack in the perfect, golden facade of his beloved son. Life fell into this new, fragile pattern for several weeks. I was no longer the first point of contact for every minor issue. My parents, forced by my new boundaries, were slowly learning to be more self-reliant. My mother downloaded a translation app on her phone and would spend evenings meticulously typing in English phrases, her brow furrowed in concentration. My father, when faced with a form, would first try to decipher it himself, sitting at the kitchen table with a dictionary, before asking Kwa for help. Kwa's help was often grudging and minimal, but it was a start. The burden on my shoulders was lighter, and I began to feel a sense of hope. Maybe things could actually change. But the universe, it seems, has a way of testing your resolve. The real crisis, the one that would threaten to shatter our fragile peace, arrived on a sweltering hot Wednesday afternoon. It didn't come in a standard windowed envelope. It came in a large, manila one with a stern, official-looking seal from the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. It had been delivered by certified mail, requiring a signature. That alone was enough to signal that this was serious. I wasn't home when it arrived. I was at the library, deep in a research paper. I found out when my phone started vibrating non-stop in my pocket. It was my mother. I ignored the first call. And the second. On the third, a sense of dread began to creep in. My mother never called 3 times in a row unless the house was on fire. I finally answered. "Hello. Lynn. Where are you?" Her voice was a high-pitched frantic squeal. "You need to come home. Now. Something bad has happened." "Me, what is it? What's wrong?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. "A letter. A very bad letter from the government. It's for the salon," she cried, her Vietnamese rushed and panicked. "Your father and I don't understand it. We showed it to Kwa, and he says he thinks we are in big trouble." My blood ran cold. The salon was their life. It was the culmination of 20 years of back-breaking work, of saving every penny, of breathing in the acrid smell of acetone day after day. It was their American dream, housed in a small storefront in a Houston strip mall. "Okay, calm down," I said, my translator instincts kicking in despite myself. "I'm on my way. Don't do anything. Just wait for me." I threw my books into my backpack and ran out of the library, my mind racing. The Department of Licensing and Regulation oversaw health and safety standards for places like nail salons. A letter from them could mean anything from a routine inspection notice to a formal complaint or a notice of violation. When I burst through the front door 20 minutes later, the scene in the living room was one of pure chaos. My mother was pacing back and forth, wringing her hands and muttering prayers. My father was sitting stiffly on the sofa, staring into space, his face pale and ashen. The manila envelope lay on the coffee table like a bomb. And Kwa was sitting in his usual armchair, scrolling through his phone. I stared at him. "You're just sitting there?" I demanded. He looked up, startled. "I read it," he said defensively. "It's all in complicated legal English. I don't know what it means. I told them they should wait for you." He had already absolved himself of all responsibility. I snatched the envelope off the table and tore it open. My hands trembled as I pulled out the multi-page document. The letterhead was stark and official. The title at the top made my stomach clench: Notice of Alleged Violation and Opportunity to Settle. I scanned the document, my eyes flying across the dense paragraphs of legal text. It was a complaint, filed by a former employee they had let go a few months prior. She was alleging multiple violations: unpaid overtime, improper handling of chemicals, unsanitary workstations. The letter detailed a list of potential penalties, including hefty fines for each violation, a mandatory salon closure for a formal inspection, and the possible suspension of their business license. It was a nightmare. This wasn't a bill or a form. This was a direct threat to their livelihood. My mother stopped her pacing and looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What does it say, Lynn? Tell me." I swallowed, my throat dry. How could I translate this? How could I put words to the disaster that was laid out on these pages? "It's a complaint," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "From my. She's saying we broke the rules." My father finally spoke, his voice hollow. "What rules? We do everything right. We are clean. We pay everyone." "She says you didn't pay her for overtime," I explained, my voice shaking. "And she says the ventilation isn't good enough." "That's a lie," my father slammed his fist on the coffee table, making us all jump. "She is a liar. We fired her because she was lazy and rude to customers." He was right. I remembered But it didn't matter if she was lying. The accusations had been made. The department was now involved. We had 30 days to respond, to either accept a settlement offer which included a staggering fine or to request a formal hearing to fight the charges. My parents looked at me, their faces a mixture of terror and desperation. All the progress we had made, all the boundaries I had built, crumbled in that moment. This was not a broken credit card machine. This was a 5-alarm fire, and I was the only one who knew how to operate the fire hose. The weight of their world, which had been tentatively shared, came crashing back down onto my shoulders with the force of a tidal wave. And in that moment, I knew my quiet rebellion was over. I had to save them. In the immediate aftermath of the letter's arrival, a strange and telling dynamic took over our family. My parents, consumed by a fear so profound it was almost paralyzing, seemed to regress. They became like children, looking to me for guidance, for reassurance, for a solution to a problem that felt impossibly large. The recent tension, my father's anger, my mother's wounded silent sight all evaporated, consumed by this new, greater terror. Their pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. But their pride still dictated one thing: they refused to show their panic to me directly. Instead, they channeled all their anxiety through Kwa. It was a bizarre, indirect method of communication born from the awkwardness of our recent conflict. "Kwa, go ask your sister what this word means," my father would command, pointing at the document, even though I was sitting right across the table. Kwa, with a long-suffering sigh, would look at me. "He wants to know what 'alleged' means." "It means someone claims it's true, but it hasn't been proven," I would answer, looking directly at my father. My father would pointedly ignore my gaze and nod at Kwa, as if my brother were the one who had provided the information. They were trying to save face, trying to maintain the family hierarchy where the son was the intermediary and the father was in charge. But it was a transparent, pathetic charade. They were scared, and they were leaning on Kwa to be the bridge back to me, the daughter they had alienated. Kwa, for his part, was a terrible bridge. He was impatient and utterly out of his depth. He'd try to use the translation app on his phone for complex legal phrases, then get frustrated when it spat out nonsensical garbage. "The app says, disposition means a person's inherent qualities of mind and character," he announced one evening, looking up from his phone with an air of discovery. "In this context, it means the final settlement or resolution of the case, Kwa," I said, my voice flat with exhaustion. I was hunched over my laptop, cross-referencing the Texas Administrative Code with articles about labor disputes. My own coursework lay forgotten in my backpack. "Well, how am I supposed to know that?" he snapped, his ego bruised. "It's not my fault this is all so confusing." My head whipped up from the screen. "No, it's not your fault that it's confusing," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "It's your fault that you're not even trying. You're just waiting for me to do it. You're a bystander in your own family's crisis." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. My mother shot me a warning look, a silent plea to not start another fight, not now. I bit my tongue and turned back to the laptop, the anger a hot coil in my gut. Their attempts to handle the situation through Kwa were not just inefficient, they were making things worse. Based on Kwa's clumsy interpretation of the letter, my father became convinced that the best strategy was to call the former employee, and yell at her until she retracted her complaint. "We will tell her she is a liar and we will sue her for defamation," he declared, his face red with fury. "Bah, no," I said, my head snapping up. "That is the worst possible thing you could do. It could be seen as witness intimidation. It will make us look guilty, even if we're not." Kwa said we should fight back, my father insisted, gesturing towards my brother. I turned to Kwa, my eyes blazing. "Did you tell him to do that?" Kwa shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I just said she's lying. We shouldn't let her get away with it." "That's not a legal strategy, Kwa. That's playground talk." I was practically shouting now. "This isn't a game. They could lose everything." The reality of the situation was beginning to dawn on me. My family was adrift in a legal ocean, and they were putting their faith in a navigator who couldn't even read a map. If I let them continue on this path, they would steer us straight into the rocks. My brief experiment in letting them be self-sufficient was a failure. Not because they were incapable, but because they were actively choosing the path of most resistance, led by a son who valued his own comfort above their well-being. The turning point came 2 nights later. I was up late, my room lit only by the glow of my computer screen. I had spent hours researching, printing out documents, and making lists of pro bono legal aid societies that help small business owners. My eyes were burning, and my head ached. I felt a familiar despair creeping in, the weight of it all pressing down on me. There was a soft knock on my door. I expected it to be my mother, bringing me a slice of fruit, a silent peace offering. But when I opened the door, it was my father. He stood in the hallway, his shoulders slumped. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the usual stoic lines on his face deepened with worry. He wasn't holding a document. He wasn't giving an order. He was just standing there, looking at me. "Lin," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. He used my name, not as a summons, but as a recognition. He looked into my room, at the stacks of paper on my desk, at the screen full of legal text. He saw, for the first time, the sheer volume of the work I was doing. We don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He said it in Vietnamese, the language of our home, of our family, of vulnerability. He wasn't looking at Qua. He wasn't trying to maintain a facade. He was speaking directly to me. For the first time since this nightmare began, he was truly asking for my help. Not demanding it. Not expecting it. Asking for it. It was a confession of defeat. A surrender. He was a proud man, a man who had forged a life in a new country through sheer force of will. To admit he was lost, to admit he needed his daughter not just as a translator but as a guide, was a monumental act. In that moment, all the anger, all the resentment I had been holding onto, seemed to dissolve. It was replaced by a deep, aching wave of love and compassion for this tired, scared man who was my father. He wasn't just a source of my frustration, he was a person, terrified of losing everything he had worked for. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in, Ba," I said softly. He walked into my small room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. He sat on the edge of my bed, his big, work-worn hands resting on his knees. He looked at the chaos of papers on my desk. "You've been doing all this?" he asked. I nodded. "I've been trying to understand our options." He was silent for a long time, just looking at the evidence of my silent labor. "We messed up," he said finally, not looking at me but at the floor. "We put too much on you." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't an apology, not in the American sense. There was no, "I'm sorry." But in the language of my father, it was the closest he could get. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition of my burden. I took a deep breath, pushing my own exhaustion aside. "It's okay, Ba," I said. "We'll figure it out. Together." He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like we were on the same side. The battle wasn't me against them. It was us against the problem. And with that small, crucial shift, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The burden was still heavy, but I was no longer carrying it alone in the dark. A light had been switched on. My father's late-night visit was the catalyst. It didn't magically solve our problems, but it changed the entire emotional landscape of our home. It was as if a dam of unspoken resentment had broken, and now, the hard work of cleanup could begin. "I will help," I told him that night, my voice steady. "I will do everything I can. But I have one condition." He looked at me, his expression wary but open. "What is it?" "When this is over," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "no matter the outcome, we are all going to sit down and talk. All four of us. No more silence, no more pretending. We need to have a real conversation about how this family is going to work from now on." He hesitated for only a second before giving a firm nod. "Duak, okay." It was a promise. With that agreement in place, I dove headfirst into the fray. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, emails, and frantic research. My bedroom transformed into a war room. I spent hours on the phone with legal aid societies, only to be told that my parents' salon, while small, made just enough money to disqualify them for free services. The irony was bitter, they were too poor to afford a lawyer but too rich to get help. I learned a new vocabulary: depositions, discovery, mediation, statutes. I read online forums for small business owners, piecing together advice and warnings. The picture that emerged was grim. The state tended to side with the employee in these disputes, and fighting the allegations in a formal hearing would be costly and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. The settlement, as painful as it was, might be the only viable path. Throughout this process, Kwa remained a ghost in the machine. He saw that I had taken over, and with a palpable sense of relief, he retreated back to the comfortable bubble of his own life. He'd wander into my room, see me on the phone, and quietly back out. He offered no help, asked no questions. He was a passenger, content to let his sister pilot the ship through the storm. His detachment, once a source of burning anger, now just made me feel a profound sense of pity for him. He was missing the most important lesson of his new life in America, that family wasn't just about receiving love and support, but about giving it. Finally, after a week of dead ends, I found a lifeline. A non-profit organization that offered low-cost mediation services for labor disputes. It wasn't a lawyer, but it was a neutral third party who could help us negotiate with Mai and the state, to try and reach a more reasonable settlement. It was our best shot. I presented the option to my parents. I laid out the costs, the risks, and the potential benefits. I didn't soften the blow. I explained that they would likely still have to pay a fine, but mediation could help reduce the amount and avoid the public spectacle of a hearing. My father, now trusting my judgment completely, agreed immediately. My mother, seeing his resolve, nodded along, her face still etched with worry. The day of the mediation was gray and overcast, the Houston sky matching my mood. We sat on one side of a sterile conference table. Mai, the ex-employee, sat on the other, accompanied by a stern-looking official from the Department of Licensing. The mediator, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Davis, sat at the head of the table. This was it. This was the moment where my years of informal training would be put to the ultimate test. I was no longer just translating bills, I was translating my family's future. The mediation was grueling. Mai listed her grievances, her voice full of righteous anger. The state official quoted regulations and codes. My father, his temper simmering, wanted to rebut every accusation. My job was to be the calm center of the storm. I translated Mai's claims into Vietnamese for my parents, keeping my voice neutral, filtering out the emotion to present only the facts. Then, I translated my father's impassioned, defensive responses back into polite, professional English for the mediator. My father says that he has always paid his employees fairly and that he has receipts to prove it, I would say, while my father was actually shouting, "Tell her she's a liar. She never worked a minute of overtime in her life." I walked a tightrope, balancing my duty to my parents with the need for diplomacy. I saw Kwa's absence for what it was, a blessing. He would have been a disaster in this room, his impatience and pride inflaming the situation beyond repair. After 3 hours, we reached a compromise. We didn't admit guilt, but we agreed to pay a reduced fine. We also agreed to have a professional company come in and certify our ventilation system and to provide a new training session on chemical handling for all employees. It was a financial hit and a blow to my father's pride, but it was survivable. The salon would stay open. The license would not be suspended. We had weathered the storm. Driving home, the silence in the car was heavy, but it was the silence of exhaustion, not anger. My parents looked drained, but relieved. The worst was over. That night, after a quiet dinner, I looked at my father. "Now," I said softly. "We talk." He nodded. My mother looked nervous, but she sat down at the kitchen table. I went to the living room, where Kwa was, as usual, playing a game. "Kitchen. Now," I said. It wasn't a request. He grumbled but followed me, slouching into a chair. The four of us were finally assembled. I took a deep breath. I had rehearsed this speech in my head 1,000 times. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. For almost my entire life, I began, looking at each of them in turn, my most important role in this family has been the translator. I became an adult when I was a child because I had to. I missed school events to go to your doctor's appointments, me. I failed a math test in high school because I was up all night trying to figure out our tax forms, bah. I did it because I love you and because you needed me. I paused, letting the words sink in. But I'm not a little girl anymore. And I can't be your full-time, unpaid assistant for the rest of my life. I have my own dreams. I have my own future. I deserve to have a life that isn't just about solving your problems. Then, I turned my gaze to Kwa. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, refusing to meet my eyes. And you, I said, my voice hardening slightly. You are not a guest here. You are a son and a brother. You've been here for months, and you have not lifted a finger to help. When this crisis happened, you disappeared. You left it all for me to handle. Do you have any idea what the last few weeks have been like? Do you even care? The direct confrontation stunned him into silence. He just stared at the table, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and, for the first time, what looked like shame. I love this family, I finished, my voice softening again as I looked back at my parents. But things have to change. The burden has to be shared. You have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet in this country. And he, I gestured to Kwa, has to learn to be a part of this family, not just a freeloader living in it. I will always help you when you truly need it. But I will no longer be your first and only call for every little thing. My job as the family translator is over. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke. My words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. I had laid everything bare, my sacrifice, my resentment, my love, and my ultimatum. The foundation of our family had been shaken to its core. Now, we would see if it would collapse, or if we could find a way to rebuild it, stronger and more honest than before. The kitchen table felt like a courtroom after the verdict had been read. My words, my testimony, hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. My mother was the first to break. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another. She didn't make a sound, just sat there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It wasn't the wounded, manipulative crying I had seen before, this was the cry of genuine sorrow, of a mother realizing the unintended pain she had caused her child. My father sat like a man carved from stone, his face a complex mask of shame, regret, and a flicker of the old pride warring within him. He stared at his hands, clasped so tightly on the table his knuckles were white. He was a man who had never been good with words, and in this moment of profound emotional gravity, he had none. But the most telling reaction came from Kwa. He was still not looking at me, but his head was bowed. The usual defiant slouch was gone. He looked small, diminished. My direct accusation that he was a freeloader, a bystander had finally pierced his thick armor of apathy. The shame I had glimpsed earlier was now a dark flush creeping up his neck. I had said my piece. I had nothing left to add. Without another word, I stood up and went to my room, closing the door behind me. I didn't slam it. I just closed it, a quiet, definitive click that signaled the end of an era. I half expected someone to follow me, to argue, to apologize. But no one did. I was left alone with the echo of my own words and a heart that felt both lighter and heavier than ever before. The days that followed were not silent, like before. They were quiet. It was a contemplative quiet, thick with unspoken thoughts and tentative shifts in behavior. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I created distance, not as a punishment, but as a necessity. I needed space to breathe, to be just Lin, not the translator, not the savior. I focused on catching up with my classes, burying myself in the library, reclaiming the pieces of my own life I had abandoned during the crisis. I took extra shifts at Boba Bliss, finding solace in the mundane routine. I didn't offer to help with anything. And for the first time, they didn't ask. One afternoon, I came home to find a pamphlet on the kitchen table. It was from the local community college, advertising English as a Second Language, ESL, evening classes for adults. No one mentioned it. It just sat there, a silent acknowledgement. A first step. The first real change came from the most unlikely source. A few days after our talk, I saw Kwa sitting at the kitchen table, a laptop open in front of him. It wasn't a game or a movie. He was looking at job application websites. He was clumsy with his searches, typing in broad terms like job in Houston, but he was trying. Later that week, I overheard him on the phone, stumbling through a conversation with a bank representative about opening his own checking account. "Yes, I want to, open account," he said, his voice hesitant. "For me. My name is Kwon Gwyn." He struggled. He had to ask the representative to repeat herself several times. It was a painful, awkward conversation, the kind I had been shielding him and my parents from for years. I stood in the hallway, hidden from view, listening. A part of me, the old me, instinctively wanted to rush in, take the phone, and smooth it all over. It would be easier, the old voice whispered. It would be faster. But I stayed put. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding, and I let him struggle. I let him fail and try again. Because his success was not the point. His effort was. When he finally hung up, he let out a long, frustrated sigh, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, the weary pride of someone who has accomplished something difficult on their own. He had done it. Without me. My mother's change was quieter. She enrolled in an online ESL course that she could do from home. In the evenings, I would see her at the kitchen table, headphones on, her lips moving silently as she repeated English phrases from her tablet. "Where is the library?" she'd whisper. "How much does this cost?" Her progress was slow, her accent thick, but there was a determination in her eyes I hadn't seen before. She was taking ownership of her voice. My father was the most resistant to change, but even he made small, almost imperceptible shifts. He started dealing with the salon suppliers himself. His English was broken, a pidgin of essential nouns and verbs, but he got his point across through sheer force of will. He started treating me differently, too. He would see me studying and quietly place a glass of orange juice on my desk without a word. It was his way of saying, "I see you. I see your life. It is important." The atmosphere in the house began to lighten. The oppressive tension was replaced by a kind of gentle, hard-working focus. We were all on our own paths, but for the first time, it felt like we were all moving in the same direction towards independence. One evening, I came home late from a study session with my new group. The house was quiet. In the kitchen, I found a note on the counter, next to a plate of food covered with plastic wrap. The handwriting was my father's, a messy, blocky script. It was in Vietnamese. "Lynn, your mother and I went to a meeting at the community center about small business grants. Kwa drove us. Eat your dinner." I stared at the note. So many things were contained in those few short sentences. They had gone to a meeting, on their own. Kwa had driven them, taking on a simple, familial responsibility. And they had left me a note, considering my schedule, respecting my life outside of them. I warmed up the plate of food com swan, my favorite. As I sat at the quiet kitchen table, eating the grilled pork and rice my mother had saved for me, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The changes were small, almost invisible to an outsider. There had been no grand apology, no dramatic family therapy session. But in the quiet actions, in the spaces between the words, everything was different. We were healing, not by talking about the wound, but by learning to walk without a limp. The months that followed were a testament to the quiet power of incremental change. Our family didn't magically transform into a perfect, harmonious unit. There were still moments of friction, old habits that died hard. Occasionally, my mother would start to hand me a piece of mail before catching herself, pulling it back with a small, embarrassed smile. "Me try first," she'd say, heading for her dictionary. My father would sometimes start a sentence in Vietnamese, asking for a favor, then trail off and rephrase it as a suggestion for quoi. Quoi was the most dramatic transformation. After 2 weeks of searching, he got a job. It wasn't glamorous, was a stalker at a large grocery store, but it was his. He came home from his first shift looking exhausted but proud, his face smudged with dirt. He had his own money, his own responsibilities. He started paying for his own gas, contributing a small amount to the household bills without being asked. He still played his video games, but he no longer lived solely within their digital worlds. He was connecting to the real one cardboard box at a time. Our relationship shifted, too. We weren't close, not in the way Chloe was with her siblings, who shared inside jokes and years of common memories. We had a 12-year gap of silence between us that could not be easily filled. But we were no longer adversaries. We were allies. Cautious ones, but allies nonetheless. Sometimes, he'd ask me a question about an English word he'd heard at work, or I'd ask him about a new movie. They were small, simple interactions, but they were the seeds of a new kind of siblinghood, one built not on a shared past, but on a shared present. I learned to recalibrate my role in the family. I was no longer the chief operating officer, I was a consultant. They would still come to me with the big, truly complicated issues, but only after they had exhausted their own resources. I would help, but I would do it as a partner, not a parent. "Okay, let's look at this together," became my new refrain. It was a subtle but profound difference. The burden was no longer solely mine, it was ours to share. My life blossomed. I was doing well in school, my grades better than ever. I had time for my friends, for hobbies, for simply being a 19-year-old. I learned to relax my shoulders, which I hadn't realized had been perpetually tensed for the better part of a decade. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my lifelong companion finally began to recede. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after the talk, I was sitting in a sunny cafe with Chloe, laughing about her latest dating misadventure. The sun streamed through the window, warming my face. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. My phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID read, "Me." The old, Pavlovian knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach for a split second before I consciously willed it away. I answered, my voice light. "Hi, me." "Hello, Lynn," my mother's voice came through the phone. She was speaking English. Her accent was thick, her grammar imperfect, but she was clear. "I am at the salon. A customer, she like her nails very much. She asked me how to say, 'You did a good job.'" I blinked, momentarily confused. "She's asking you how to say that?" No, my mother laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "I want to say to her. For her nails. You did a good job on picking the color." A smile spread across my face. It was such a small, human thing. A simple desire to connect, to offer a compliment. A conversation she could have easily had in Vietnamese or just skipped altogether. But she wanted to try. She wanted to use her new words. "Oh," I said, my heart feeling impossibly full. "Me, you could say, 'That color looks great on you.' Or, 'You have great taste.'" I could hear her repeating the phrases softly to herself on the other end. "Great taste, yes. I like. Okay. Thank you, Con," she said. "You're welcome, me. I'll see you at home later." "Okay. Bye-bye." I hung up the phone and looked out the window, a grin stretching across my face. Chloe was watching me, a knowing smile on her own face. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, the word feeling bigger and more true than ever before. "Everything is great." It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a demand. It was just a call. A mother asking her daughter for a little help with her English, not because she was helpless, but because she was learning. I hadn't been her translator. I had just been her daughter. That evening, when I got home, the house was filled with the familiar, comforting smell of my mother's cooking. Kwa was in the kitchen, showing my father a funny video on his phone. They were both laughing. My mother was at the stove, humming to herself. She looked up when I walked in and gave me a bright, genuine smile. In that moment, I saw my family with perfect clarity. A collection of flawed, resilient people, bound together not by obligation, but by a stubborn, enduring love. The silence was gone, replaced by the easy, comfortable sounds of a family at peace. My burden hadn't vanished, it had transformed. It was no longer a weight that I carried alone, but a tapestry that we were all weaving together, each with our own thread. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. I was no longer the translator. I was just Lin. And that was more than enough.